Hello everyone. So today I'm going to walk you through the basics for Scratchboard. So I'm going to show you some tools and tell you how to get started and give you some tips and tricks on how to use this, especially if you've never used Scratchboard before. It can feel a little unfamiliar at first. So to do the Scratchboard project, you're going to need your piece of Scratchboard, which is the black coated paper that's in your pack. So it has a sort of a paint coating on it, and when you scratch at that coating like this, it comes off, and you should have a white coated paper that has black on top. So you're going to be creating a black and white drawing essentially, and you can't really get gray, but you can get areas that are going to be perceived as gray by doing like cross hatching and not scratching away as much of the black. So to start this project, along with the Scratchboard, you're going to need a scratcher. Everybody should have one of these in their kit. It's got this red handle and it should have the little metal tip inside it. Everybody should have the same size. You can definitely use tools other than the Scratchboard scratchers. You can scratch with your fingernails, really any sharp object or any object with an edge, but I recommend using the scratcher, and I've been able to get pretty good control with this size and shape of head. So I would just stick with that, but if you really want to introduce other tools, you can. You're also going to need, if you have a printer, a printed photo. I think it's easier to work with the printed photo. If you don't have a printer, then you can use a photo on your phone screen, which I have been going back and forth between the photo on my phone and the printed photo, or you can use your Chromebook, which I recommend because it's just going to be bigger, so you're not going to have to constantly zoom in. But I've just been using my phone and going back and forth between that and the photo. And the reason I did that is just because my photo didn't print correctly. I was running out of black ink, so it printed some of the shadow areas as highlight areas, which doesn't really help me as I'm laying this out. So I chose not to do a grid, but I did choose to do something that's similar to a grid, a little bit faster to set up, and I think involves less drawing on the Scratchboard. So if you really want to use a grid, you're welcome to grid your paper and then to grid your Scratchboard. But this is a technique that's sort of halfway in between just sort of freehanding and using the grid. So what I did was I folded my paper in half widthwise, and then you can keep it that way and fold it in half again, but I fold it in half widthwise, and then I folded it in half lengthwise and just created a crease, and then I used a pencil just to darken that crease because it was easier to see than looking at the crease. So now I have four kind of quadrants or four sections, so I can focus on just one section at a time, and that helps me, especially since I have a really busy landscape, and it helps me focus on just one section of landscape at a time. And when I'm working in these bigger sections, I'll use the trees as sort of landmarks, and I'll work in between each tree. So I'll just focus on this section, and then I'll just focus on like this section. So I would definitely think about ways that you can cut down on the busyness of your image when you're looking at it. So really thinking about working in sections. And then I used a ruler and I measured out the exact same measurements on my paper. They're kind of light so you can't see them all, but this line that runs through right here is the width line that's dividing it in half this way. And then the line here, you can't see it, not the one under my hand, but there's a very, very faint line which is not showing up. So I did all of that in pencil, and that is what I recommend you use to lay out those quadrants. And if you decide to do a grid, I would do it in pencil, and I would do it very lightly. Because while you can put the pencil down and it doesn't scratch into the surface if you're not pushing very hard, you can't really erase that pencil mark. So I would go very lightly, and I laid out this path in pencil, and again, I did that very lightly. I knew that path was going to have a lot of scratching on it, so I wasn't as concerned. and like this little area here where I had the wrong angle, there are a lot of plants over there. So I think that this line eventually will disappear. But I do recommend that you go as lightly as possible when you're using your pencil. So I just used a regular HB pencil. I recommend something HB or softer because if you use one of the like 2H pencils, it's got a harder tip, so you run the risk of it scratching into your scratch board in places where you don't want it to scratch. So definitely think about your pressure and your choice of pencil. You could use your scratcher to scratch the grid lines in, but I don't recommend that because you're probably going to end up with grid lines permanently scratched in there and you're going to see it in your final piece. So I recommend using a pencil when you're laying this out. So something like this, and I also recommend that you don't sharpen the pencil fully, like have a more of a flat, smooth tip, because that again decreases the risk of you scratching into the scratch board and should help you make a softer line. So don't use a really, really sharp pencil. So once you have everything, at least your basic shapes laid out, which is what I did, I didn't go in and try to lay out every detail, you can start scratching. My recommendation is that you start with something really obvious. So I started with the path because I knew that that was going to be something I wanted to have more detailed, and really I was going to need to be careful about my proportions, whereas with like the plants over here, it's not as big a deal if my proportions are a little off because they're plants. Who knows, you know, where the leaves were, what size they were. But if my proportions were off on this path, it was going to be really obvious. So I chose to start with that and to really focus more on the detail in this path. And I also chose to start kind of in the middle. So I ended up starting right over here because this was a really, really light patch that was just pure white. So I kind of outlined it with the scratcher, and then I went in and I scraped the pure white parts. And I didn't have to worry about like scraping around a bunch of small areas. There weren't really any shadows or gray areas. It was just a flat white. So my recommendation is finding a spot that's completely white, and it will also give you a chance to get used to your scratcher and get used to the scratch board and how it feels when it's coming off. So some tips and tricks for doing this. I will use my scratcher to lay out areas. So if I'm going to work over here on this area, what I'll do is bring up my image. So I'm just going to get that up on my phone because that area of my photo is really, or my printed photo is really, really not working at all. And probably zoom in a bit. So looking at this spot right over, let's see, right over about here, I have a small plant that I want to scratch in. So what I'll do first is I'll kind of lay that plant out really gently. So I'm just getting the sense of where the leaves are. And I have this little plant down here, which looks like I kind of positioned in the wrong spot. So that's okay. We're gonna scratch over that. And once I feel like I have that positioned correctly, there's something else over here. Then I can go in and start scratching. So when you're using the scratcher, when I laid it out, I had it kind of the flat part of the scratcher facing down. So like just like you would use a fountain pen or a pencil. So if you look at this scratcher, it has a curve to it. So there's like a concave part here, and then there's like the flat top. So this is exactly how you would use it if it was a fountain pen, but it's not a fountain pen or a dip pen. So when I was laying out, I was using it the way I would use a pen. But now that I'm scratching, I'm actually going to reverse this. And it has edges that almost look like a blade. They are slightly sharp, so be careful. And I prefer to scratch with it this way because I'm not going to dig into my paper. So you can definitely cut into the surface of your paper if you're not being careful. And I find that the scratcher works better and I have more control. So you're going to find that you need to adjust the angle that you're holding your scratcher as you move through different areas of this project. And so you're going to have to make a lot of adjustments to how you hold your hand. So just go slowly and get used to how the scratcher feels and how it's working on the surface, and just make adjustments as you go through, as you find that you need them. Another trick is I'm not holding it straight up and down. I am holding it at a 45-degree angle, and that's going to give you the most control. And it's also going to do a good job of scratching this paint off without actually cutting into the surface of your paper. And so I'm making a lot of small marks. I'm not trying to fully scratch the surface off. Like, I don't want everything to come off because then I would just have a white area, and this is more of a gray. So I'm really making small strokes and small movements to take off the black on the scratch board. Remember, when you're working with this, that you can always take more black off, but you can't add it back on. So it's better to have everything be too dark and have to go over it again than to have everything too light. If you want to make lighter areas that aren't pure white, a way to do that is cross-hatching. So let's say I want that area to be a bit lighter. I can go in and I can cross-hatch, and I still have some value in there, but it's going to read more as a gray, a very light gray, as opposed to a pure white. So you want to think about that as well when you're scratching. So that's pretty much it. So cross-hatching for your gray areas. For some areas, I hatch in just a single direction, which is going to give you a darker area. The pure black areas I'm not touching at all. And the pure white areas are completely scratched away. There's some spots where the paint that's on top has almost stained the surface, so I can't get it pure white. You guys can't see it because my camera is blowing out my highlights a little bit, but if you get closer to this, these areas don't look pure white. They look a tiny bit gray because there's spots where I just couldn't get all of the paint up. So keep in mind that that may happen, and just do your best to get your whites white. And the last trick that I have for you is to make sure that you're either blowing or brushing the excess off your board. So as you scratch, you're going to create basically dust. And I have this little computer cleaner and just use it to clean off those stray bits of black, or you can just blow on it. The computer cleaner, the little brush here, does a better job of getting any stray particles off and dust, whereas blowing doesn't work as well. If you don't have a computer cleaner, you can just use a regular paintbrush. Just make sure it's clean and dry before you use it. And that is it. That is how you use Scratchboard. So what I will do is I will finish this piece and I'll upload some like fast videos of work as well so that you guys can see how this unfolds, and then I'll put this finished piece on Classroom so that you can see the end product and what it looks like once I am done with the whole thing.